Beloved and friends, you were made by God to love Him with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. You were made by God supremely to love Him. And from the overflow of the joy that is known in loving God who has first loved us, from that overflow we are to love one another. This is the greatest of all purposes, the greatest of all meaning, the greatest of all in our existence. This is truly what Christianity champions. You exist to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And supremely, the way you glorify God is by loving Him. And if you really enjoy God, it will be evident in how you love one another. This is what we were made for. This is why we exist. This is why we are here this morning. This passage that we find ourselves in is, well, the whole passage is climactic. It might not seem like that at first, but I pray you'll see it with me. The whole thing is climactic. It really is something that deals and centers on the greatest of all. What we find here is great revelation. It's the final attempt to trap Jesus, and it proves to be tremendously great. So I want to just begin right off, and I have two main headings that I want us to think about as we consider the text. The first is going to be the malicious aim, and the second will be this majestic answer. And then at the end, I want to close us with some reflections on the contextual understanding of what's happening here. What should we take away from this? So that's the layout. We'll spend a little bit of time on the first part, most of the time in the middle, and then we'll close with this grand reflection. In the end, all of it points to the greatest of all. Let's look first at the malicious aim. Look with me, please, in Matthew 22, verse 34. The malicious aim. It says, "But when the Pharisees heard that He, Jesus, had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked Him a question to test Him. 'Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?'" We could stop right there. I want you to note first that this is about a malicious aim. The questioner is not seeking information. This is no friendly inquisitor. Sure, the encounter appears to be, less controversial. Jesus doesn't even issue a rebuke in this case like He does in the other two. And after all, the question itself, it occasions a response full of wonder and goodness. I mean, the whole interaction is something that is much more pleasant than the previous two attacks. Interaction is minimal. And in fact, no reaction is recorded by Matthew. No reaction from the lawyer or from the crowds. No reaction is recorded. And so on these accounts alone, we can see that, the encounter appears to be quite trivial, even just innocent. Some who read this then go to Luke in his account, and they point out that, the person that responds to Jesus silencing the Sadducees, who, after He silences them, says, "Well done." Some say, because of that, he's friendly. He's actually in agreement with Jesus. He's coming up with positive intent. He had just applauded Christ. "Well done, you did that well." Now, can I ask you another question? That's how some take it. Others point to Mark and in his account, and they note that at the end of this passage, Mark identifies the man as saying, Teacher, you answered, correct. Right. And so from these things, some conclude that this may indeed be an honest and friendly intent. I think you know where I'm going because I have up there malicious aim. I don't buy it. I don't think this is friendly at all. And I'm going to start right here. A closer examination will reveal that this is clearly a malicious intent and malicious aim. Let's just take a look. First and foremost, the supreme determinative factor in any interpretation is context. Context is king. Context is king. Context is king. All right. You will get tired of hearing me say that. Let's go back to context, chapter 21. Look at verse 32. What we have here is Jesus has entered into the city and he does three actions. He enters on a donkey, making claim that he's the king, fulfilling the prophecy of the entrance of the Messiah. He cleanses the temple, fulfilling Malachi, that the king will come at once and appear before his temple. And then he curses a fig tree, thereby fulfilling the prophecy of judgment upon a nation that's apostate. In response to these things, the leaders of Israel come and they begin to question him. By what authority are you doing this? And he issues three parables. Here's the response to the first one, Matthew 21:32. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even when you saw it, you did not afterward change your minds and believe him. That's how he ends his first parable. The second parable, he ends it this way, verse 43. Chapter 21, verse 43. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruit. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. Now note this little narrative. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking about them. Now, how does he, in the next parable, what does he say to them? Look at verse 7 of chapter 22. Chapter 22, verse 7. In the parable, he points to the leaders of Israel and says, the king, namely his father, was angry and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Well, these three parables, you see, were all parables of indictment. They all expose the leaders of Israel as apostate, as blind, willfully blind, and not seeing Jesus for the Christ, not receiving him as Messiah, not honoring him and worshiping him and adoring him. And after these three parables, three more things happen, and these are three ploys, schemes, attacks to tear him down, to find a way to trap him, to arrest him, to destroy him. And the first one, they come at him in chapter 22, verse 15. It says, then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. Well, they try to get him to commit treason by tribute. Treason against an imposter king, namely Caesar. When the irony is they're the ones committing treason against the real king, namely Jesus. He says, render to God what is God's and render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Who do they render Jesus to? Caesar. Whose image is Jesus? God's. Verse 18 gives the punctuation. Jesus, aware of their malice, said, why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Well, the next, number 2, attack is found following that, and that's going to be in chapter 22. He punctuates it this way, decisively pointing to their ignorance. In chapter 22, verse 23 to 33. But let's look at verse 29. 22, 29. But Jesus answered them, you are wrong, because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. So they come at him to scheme again. They seek to trap him again. They want to destroy him. And what does he do? He sees it. He says it's malicious. He says very plainly, you are trying to parizzo. You're trying to trip me up. You're trying to destroy me, tempt me. Well, I think the answer there, and this was last week's message, this is an illustrious ignorance. What Jesus does by saying, you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God, effectively saying, just like you don't know the scriptures, just like you don't know the power of God, just like you don't know the resurrection, so you don't know me. As John chapter 5, Jesus would say this, do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses. And the Sadducees held Moses as the only true authority, and Jesus says, one accuses you, Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote about me. But they were ignorant. So that's last week. And that's the context. That's amazing. I want to make it clear that it's in that line of thought that we find ourselves in verse 34. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Now, I want us to notice, if you like to take notes, let me just give you this little simple outline. A was context, to understand that it's a malicious aim. B would be the trigger. What triggered this? What triggered this passage? Look at the trigger. But when, there's the trigger. But when the Pharisees heard that he, Jesus, had silenced the Sadducees, this is an amazing tragedy. Why? Why do I say that? Because of the word when. When? I mean, the Pharisees would have otherwise applauded. They would have celebrated because they were enemies of the Sadducees on that doctrinal point. And Jesus, they couldn't silence them. They tried. The Talmud records how they tried, and they tried, and they couldn't do it. And Jesus, in a moment, just completely shuts them down. At this time, when the Pharisees saw that, they should have put all pride aside and been on their faces. You speak divine wisdom. You must be the Christ. All your claims are being authenticated before our eyes. But instead of acknowledging the majesty of Jesus in doing what they could never do, in speaking truth they agree with, instead they seek to trap him. Context A, B is the trigger, C is action. What did they do? It says they gathered together. They gathered together. Oh, and beloved and friends, remember Acts chapter 4, verse 26? This is echoing in my heart as I read this. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his anointed. This is an echo of the prophetic statement of David in Psalm 2. This is indeed a language that is unique to a principle of plotting, coming together, putting their minds together to scheme out, how can we destroy this man? I think it's very clear there's a malicious intent. The context bears it out. The trigger is completely contrary to anything reasonable, that they would go this way when they should be going that way. And third, we're getting pretty clear that this is an action that's against them. It's like 22:15. They plotted, they came together and plotted. D would be delegation. I want you to note this. Look at the delegation. This points it out that it's malicious. One of them a lawyer. Now some take this as a man who was impressed with Jesus, as I said. In fact, so difficult has this been for many in church history that one tradition has argued against the point by saying that this man was one of the Pharisees who did applaud Jesus. And as a response, the rest of the council rebuked him and forced him to go to Jesus to ask this question as his penance. In other words, don't applaud him. Come here, huddle. Okay, now you're going to go to him and you're going to ask this question. That's what tradition says. But let us not fail to see what's going on here. In the Greek text, it uses an important term, nomikos. Nomikos is an expert in the law, the elite. This is their expert man. They huddle together, and the delegation principle is they're coming together, and instead of all of them coming or sending out disciples, they went from disciples who are below them to expert, their best man. Let's go send him. We'll send him. He's the most schooled in what? In what section of the Tanakh, of the Old Testament? The Torah. He is the most expert lawyer of the Torah, the book of 5 books of Moses. So they send him. And this one gets me the most. E, after delegation, E, and finally would be this. This one gets me the most. I call it temptation, because those who assume a friendly interchange here, well, they fail to adequately and consistently acknowledge the fact that the text says to test him. Parizo, not anything else, not to affirm or dokimazo, to prove him up or to show him to be genuine. No. Parizo, take him down. Well, it's not adequate to treat this word otherwise. The word most commonly means to have an aim to induce damage. It's used of traps to kill prey. And I said consistently because, well, it's exactly the same word that's used in verse 18, where Jesus himself comments and says, I see your malice. Why are you parizo me? I think it's clear through the context and all else. If we just look, this is a malicious intent. Why am I stressing this? Because now I want you to see it in its context. When you read the question, teacher, again, this false sense of, respect. Teacher, which is the greatest command? Which is the great commandment in the law? Now, right there, you might say, well, wait a second. How can that be a trap? Like, what could go wrong here? Well, a lot could go wrong here. First of all, the term that's used is a superlative. Let's just get that out of the way. Great then takes on the meaning greatest, superlative. It says, Jesus, what is the law that is of the most central importance? What has most central importance in God's law? In fact, one Jew says that nothing could be more important in a discussion between 2 rabbis than to ask which. Did you hear that? One Jew said, nothing could be more important than to ask this question: which is the great commandment of God? The greatest of all is happening here. The greatest of all questions. It's the last attack on Jesus before the cross. This is the greatest of all. There's a climactic thing going on here I want you to see. Let's get our hearts, minds around this a bit. In the Torah, the rabbis had calculated 613 commandments. And they did all kinds of funny things with numbers, but they calculated 613 commandments. And they had to sort of make distinctions between them because you couldn't just memorize all of them and treat them all equal. You had to sort of have some way of categorizing. And so they had what they called the great and the small commandments, or the heavy and the light commandments. In fact, if you drop your eyes down to chapter 23 and look at verse 23, you'll see Jesus himself uses that same formulaic principle. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, For you tithe mint and dill and cumin. Those are laws that the rabbis held very high. And then he says, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. Now here's where Jesus corrects any kind of nonsense thinking that says, well, if you have greater and lesser laws, does that mean that the lesser ones, like it's lesser, you don't need to worry about those? Like you could just sin? No. The point is, which are more central, which are more substantial. Look at what he says at the end of verse 23. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. But his point is, there are weightier ones. So it's a legitimate rabbinical technique, and this happened to be the greatest of all. Ranking the commandments is something that is inherently risky. It caused great controversy and division in Judaism. Whole schools of thought would basically attach to a rabbi's statement of which one is the greatest. So this is a surefire way to cause among the religious, pious Jews, cause division about this Messiah. Well, I'll just give you a rundown of some examples. The Talmud gives us Jewish commentary from what the rabbis taught. It gives us quite a list of things that they would say were the greatest commandments. In fact, they point out that David in Psalm 15 gave 11 of the greatest commandments. They say that Isaiah gave 6 in chapter 33. They also say then some of the rabbis said, no, Micah, the prophet Micah gave us 3 of the greatest commandments. And that would be found right there in chapter 6, verse 8, where it is said to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Well, other rabbis said, no, Isaiah is back in the ranks. He gave us 2. He gave us 2 in 56:1, keep justice and do righteousness. Other rabbis came along and said, no, Habakkuk 2:14, that's the one. And it's simply this, the just shall live by faith. We like that one. Other rabbis insisted that no, it has to be idolatry. Idolatry has to be the greatest commandment. You shall not you shall not make an idol for yourself to bow down to it. Others said, no, Sabbath. It's the distinctive among our people. Others said, no, it's got to be the sacrifices. The sacrifices have to be done right. Do you remember what happened to, Nadab and Abihu? Sacrifices got to be right. Others said, no, it's circumcision. Faith of our father Abraham. Others said, no, it's obedience to parents. Otherwise, you're not going to inherit the land. Others said, no, it's purification laws. I mean, that's what separates us from everyone else. In fact, the Pharisees, the word in Hebrew means the purified ones. There we go. So, I hope this has helped to show that you could see that this could be a trap very easily. An open-ended question. What are you going to say, Jesus? Who are you going to divide here? Which school of thought are you going to go with? Well, though they had aimed maliciously, we have reason to be thankful that this question was even asked in the first place. For through it our Lord furnishes a most majestic answer, full of precious instruction, one that I'm so thankful and excited to consider. And when we think on this, I want you to see that here yet is another example of how God can bring good out of evil. This was a malicious aim. And Jesus turns it and gives us some of the most powerful teaching on love. So now let's look at the majestic answer. Verse 37, and he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Oh, we should just pause, tremble. That is amazing. I want you to notice something, that all the other rabbinical claims to the greatest commandment, all of them were from outside of the Torah. Jesus gives an answer right from the center. Not only does he cite a verse, for instance, of Moses. No. Of all things, he goes to the Shema. This is the most fundamental creed, the central and best known text of all Judaism. Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. B'havta et Yahweh Eloheka. B'kal levavka, uvkal nefeshka, uvkal meodeka. That's Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Meodeka. This is the central, most important, most recited statement in all of Judaism. It is in the mezuzah, the little box at an angle on the doorpost. You open that up, and inside's a little piece of paper scroll wrapped up, and on it has Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, although they say it Adonai, because they don't want to say Yahweh. So, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu. It's in the phylacteries, the little black box on the head or on the arm. It's inside that box. Twice a day, even to this day, faithful Orthodox Jews pray that prayer twice a day. It's amazing that no one before Jesus said, that's it. You would think this is the heart of the Torah. Oh, and it's, beloved and friends, listen, it's not just love that Jesus says, because I want to make sure I'm speaking to a 21st century Silicon Valley Americanized culture. And, well, there is much talk about love these days. A love that is contrary to what Jesus means. There's a lot of talk about love. Love is a word that is used in our day, in our time, to justify immorality. Love is a word that is used to talk about perversion. So let's be careful when we think love is the answer. We were made to love. We were made to love, but not a love that we define, not a love that is defined by our feelings, not a love that starts with humanity. We were made to love. But the reason the Shema, the greatest command to love, the reason it begins with Shema, which means hear, Shema Yisrael, listen, Israel. The reason it begins there is because you cannot love what you do not know. So the very first thing to this love is you've got to know God. You've got to know Him rightly. That's why Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. You've got to know who He is. You've got to know He is one. You've got to know His supreme majesty. You've got to know God before you can talk about love. This idea of the Echad it signifies really a compound unity. It doesn't mean one as Eyad. It's not just like one among many, but rather it is one like a bushel or a bundle of grapes or something. It's one. And I say that only because it speaks of really an effulgent majesty of God, that He is the only and supreme being. And Eloheka, well, that is a name, a great name that really epitomizes the gospel itself in early form. It's the idea to know God as your God. The Lord, your God. He is the supreme one. I pray, let these things sink down in your hearts. We were made to love God. This is the most inward and the most comprehensive of all purposes and all duty. The sum of all our accountability before God is love. I want to give you 3 basic little subpoints about this love. 3. A would be, it's a commanded love. It's a commanded love. Don't miss the fact that it's a commanded love. You shall, it's imperative. You must do this. This is what you're called to do. This is what you were made for. This is your highest obligation, to love God. Spurgeon always says it best. As our Creator, preserver, provider, and judge, He commands us to yield to Him all our heart's affection, to love Him first, best, heartiest, out of all comparison to the love we have to any fellow creature or to ourselves. Indeed, it is the most fundamental motive of all human action. Love is, which can sometimes be lust, called love, but love is the most fundamental motive to a right human action. Love delights to serve the one being loved. Love gives of self in order for the blessing or the glory of the one it loves. Love is commanded and also issues in obedience to command because it's from the heart. I think Luther, he nailed it, and I love this. When he basically compiled his catechism and he taught through the 10 commandments, he started each commandment by a preface. And the preface was always, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he'd give the commandment. You shall love the Lord your God. And so the point is to show, I think he nailed it, the principle is that love motivates right obedience. Let me just remind us, and I'll do this very quickly, but there are so many places in the Torah alone where God tells his people to love. In Deuteronomy 10:12, now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to love him. To love him. In Deuteronomy 11:1, you shall therefore love the Lord your God and keep his charge. 11:13, and if you indeed obey my commandments that I commanded you today, to love the Lord your... Do you hear what he just said? God spoke to the people of Israel and said, all the commandments I give to you today, here's what they are, to love me. 11:22, for if you will be careful to do all this commandment that I command you today to do, loving the Lord your God. 13:11 or 13:3, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. 19:9, by loving the Lord your God and by walking ever in his ways. This is what God has provided for us and commanded us to do. Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, and the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. Oh, I love that. He says, look, you got to have a new heart. The Old Testament did teach regeneration. It says your heart had to be circumcised because it goes hand in hand with faith, and circumcision was the sign of faith that Abraham had. You just believe God, You don't do so. You just believe God and it's reckoned to you righteous. And that's a symbol. Faith brings about this new heart. And what does the heart do but love? Oh, your hearts must be circumcised so that you would love the Lord your God. Oh, and it goes on and on, 30, verse 16, 30, verse 19 and 20, and on and on and on. Listen to J.C. Ryle. He says, love is the grand secret of true obedience to God. When we feel towards him as children feel towards a dear father, we shall delight to do his will. We shall not find his commandments grievous and work for him like slaves under fear of the lash. We shall take pleasure in trying to keep his laws and mourn when we transgress them. None work so well as they who work for love. the fear of punishment, or the desire of reward are principles of far less power. They do the will of God best who do it from the heart. It is a commanded love. And secondly, B, it's a committed love. Committed love, as in a marriage, as in a covenant. Because these words are not spoken. God doesn't just dispense them to any old person and say, oh, I just love everyone the same. No, this is a covenant people. And he says, I am loving you in a special way, a distinctive, committed way. I call you to love me like that. God is not interested in us giving him love alongside of other loves. It's a committed love. It's expressed in all of our conduct, in all of our relationships, like my committed love to my wife. My love to her transforms my love for every other woman in the world. Because it's a special, committed, unique, and superlative love of a different category. It's that kind of love. God must be loved and honored by us with all or not at all. Wives don't want to be loved halfway or most of the way. Wives want to be loved all or nothing. It's a committed love, you see. It encompasses the idea of faithfulness. That's the point. Faithful to what? To the commitment of love. Well, it's a commanded love, it's a committed love, it's also a comprehensive love. See, comprehensive love. I don't think I need to explain this much. I mean, you've seen it. Heart, mind, soul, heart, soul, mind. These repeated, these different words. Mark will give us 4, heart, soul, mind, and strength. The point is, they're not given for dissection. That's not the point. We're not supposed to dissect it all up and draw attention to the distinctions between them. No. Instead, it's in classical Hebraism, just like when he would say, holy, holy, holy. It's a repetition in parallel to only underscore with the greatest highlighter you can possibly put theologically on the statement. It's with everything you've got, everything inside, everything that moves you. Attention should not be on the differences between heart, soul, and mind, but on the whole, on the inclusivity, on the comprehensiveness, on the completeness, on the totality. The nuance of variation is only there to stress the whole range of your entire being. It should be truly a love that dominates our emotions, a love that directs our thoughts, and a love that is dynamic in all our actions. It should be a love that is in our thoughts, that is in our intellect, that is in our conscience, that is in our affections, that is in our emotions, that is in our volition, that is in our judgments, that is in our convictions. Everything inside of us. Your will, your feelings, your resolves, your knowledge, the use of your mind, everything inside. Spurgeon again says, we are to love God with our intellect, with all the powers of our mind, bringing memory, thought, imagination, reason, judgment, and all our mental powers as willing subjects to bow at God's feet in adoration and love. And don't miss, it's comprehensive. It's all, whole. You heard when I recited it in Hebrew, the first you get the little fricative, it's called ba, right? And then it's actually plosive, and then it goes fricative. Grammar language, but it's bakal and then uvkal. That means and all. And all. The entire range of our human endeavor. Look at verse 38. Jesus just said this amazing Shema, and then he says this in verse 38. This is the great and first commandment. Let's not miss this. Great and first. Great and first. Great as in the greatest in importance, in dignity, in excellence, in glory. First, not in time, but first in priority. It's pratos, which means foremost. It's first in line. Highest priority, primacy. So don't believe the commentators when they say, oh, the two commandments are side by side, equal. Why then did Jesus say this? This one is the great and first. Barnes, I think, nails it. He says, the meaning of this is, thou shalt love him with all thy faculties or powers. Thou shalt love him supremely, more than all other beings and things, and with all the ardor possible. To love him with all the heart is to fix the affections supremely on him, more strongly than on anything else, and to be willing to give up all that we hold dear at his command. And Spurgeon again says, if necessary, we would give up our own lives rather than give up our love to God. Oh, that takes a different level, doesn't it? That takes a different meaning now, doesn't it? It's no longer a comfortable law. It is your supreme obligation to love God. And it is the fountain of all other obligations. As God is the most glorious and supreme of all beings, he is to be loved supremely. It is our universal debt. And here you got to chuckle a little bit because verse 39, well, look at it. What does he say? And, wait a second. Right there you can just stop and chuckle. What is the singular great commandment? Let me tell you what it is, and I want to tell you something else. And I've got the floor here, and you need to hear me. Jesus was asked for one, and he gives a second. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Here again, Christ quotes the Torah. Unlike the others, and uniquely, first recorded in time, Jesus brings these two together and elevates them to the place of supremacy and says they are to be joined. And it goes something like this. Do you love God? Truly? Here's a test. Do you love his image? If you love God, you will love those made in his image. If you find it easier to love God than to love his people, then this is a challenge to you. You need to come back to the Shema and understand God. The second command here derives from and seeks to fulfill the first. And the first induces the second. I think John Gill, again, does this really well. He says, this is the first command in order of nature, time, dignity, and causality. God being the first cause of all things, infinitely above all creatures, and love to him being the source, spring, and cause of love to neighbor. Well, it is the greatest in its object, nature, manner, and end. You see, it's about vertical moving into the horizontal. It's about a theocentricity that gives way to an anthropocentricity. It's God-centered before you go to man. And only the strength of the vertical can supply you with the strength of the horizontal. If you get that out of balance, you will err. In fact, in Leviticus, what Jesus quotes, Leviticus 19:18, it literally says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Oh yeah, you gotta love it. You know what he says when he says that in Leviticus? The reason you do this, because I am. He is the basis of it. The point is, this idea to love one another was never intended to be abstracted as some purely human ethic. It stands on the gracious ground of God's covenant, of knowing God. So the fact that human beings seek love is only an echo of the image made in them. But the fact that they pervert love and they disdain God and try to celebrate a love of their own is taking something God made for his glory and perverting it, making them guilty. We cannot do that. Notice Jesus says it's like it. It's like it. It resembles it in importance and dignity and purity and in usefulness. It's like it. It directs and fixes our focus where? On us? No. Outside of us. Both commandments do. Here's the deal. Love God, love others. This kind of got me because then you see that word as yourself. As yourself. And as Shepherd Rodney prayed rightly, we love ourselves a whole lot. Now this got me, okay? This got me. You gotta pull in with me. Think with me on this. This is so significant. I was thinking on this and praying and going over, and it just hit me. Huge light went on. I went, oh, wait a second. This, as yourself, is the only kind of love never commanded. Totally assumed, totally expected, totally presupposed. You already love yourself so much. So Jesus is going to take it and say, well, this comes natural to you. I've got to command you to love God and command you to love others because left to yourself, you just love yourself. So let me use that as a measure to say, let's take that and put it on others. That is convicting. So don't believe that in any way this is a call to love yourself, that this is something that, like psychology wants to tell you, that you need to love yourself before you can love God. Well, doesn't that just turn the whole biblical pattern on its head? Are you with me? Right? You know what you will hear today? You're going to hear, you've got to love yourself before you can love him. You've got to love yourself before you can love God. You've got to love yourself before you... No, Jesus says, you've got to know God before you can love. To know God, you've got to be loved by him. And if you know the love of God, then the only possible response rightly would be to love him with all that you are. And out of the overflow of that joy, to love one another, made in his image. Some people will say, well, I don't love myself. I don't even like myself. Well, I beg to differ. I think you could say you're not satisfied with yourself, but that seems to suggest that you actually want more of yourself. Like you actually wish that you were prettier, more handsome, stronger, more talented, more... That's why you don't like yourself. So you really love yourself, and you're discouraged because you want more of yourself. Some would say, well, what about suicide? It's a very sensitive subject, one that my heart aches. But even suicide, you got the will of God who gives you life, and you've got your own pain, discouragement, depression, and I would submit it's largely because you love yourself so much that you would be willing to defy the God who gives you life and take it in your own hands because your comfort is more important than loving God. No, we all love ourselves way too much, even the depressed. Now, let me give you some examples. How much of your life centers around the care and the comfort of your life? How much of your life is spent seeking pleasure? How much of your life is spent seeking relief from pain? If there was a threat of a bomb in this room right now, every one of you would love yourself and get up and run. Sometimes to the neglect of others. That's how much we love ourselves. In fact, it's seen all the time in the grocery store. Just do this. I did this one time in seminary. It just cracked me up. I stood over there on the corner aisle watching the apple bin. You would not believe how many people do not just pick apples. They have to look at them and turn them around. Okay. Do you think they do that because they don't love themselves? You know what happens when people get food for homeless? They don't do that. Just throw it in there. Come on. We love ourselves a lot. How many people spend their life seeking health, wealth, prosperity on self? No, when Jesus says love your neighbor as yourself, he's not telling you need to love yourself more. He's saying take all of that and treat other people like it. He's saying this, treat them as you would. You know, when we do that too, treat them as you would me, kind of thing. That's what he means here, as. The idea, let me kind of give a paraphrase. It'd be something like this. You love yourself truly, really, fervently, freely, constantly. You hide your own defects and deformities, and you seek the best for your life. Now go and do to others likewise. Hide their deformities, hide their defects, hide their weaknesses and failings. Maximize the good they do and minimize the times they hurt you. Seek their care and their comfort and relief from pain. Seek their health and their wealth and their prosperity. Go and love others like you do yourself. That's more the idea. Now just imagine if we, just right here, this people right here, if we genuinely sought to promote the care and comfort of others, their happiness in every way we possibly can, like we do ourselves, seeking to lighten their burdens and to ease their sorrows and increase their joys, to protect and to promote their health and their well-being in total. I mean, if we treated others like we treat ourselves every day, when you get a little stomach growl, you got to go feed yourself. What about others? If we just had that kind of sensitivity to feel the growling in other people's needs and respond so instinctively and so resolved, that we would love like that. That's what Jesus means. And in case we didn't catch it, I want you to get Philippians 2. Remember this? Paul says, if there's any comfort of love, and then he says, very simply, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourself. So I do believe that what he means by saying, as yourself, love others as yourself, he's saying it preempts love for self. Do it for others first. Now, right there, if you're listening and you're genuinely hearing and thinking and processing this and not being lost in the love of self, thinking about what you're going to eat or what you're going to do when this guy stops talking, if you're thinking with me, it might be fearful. You might begin to feel like a slippery slope, like, what? Wait, whoa. When does this stop? Like, I got to feed my family. Whoa. Here's a suggestion. Oh, just remember the Lord's words. There was a great and first command, and that will supply all your needs. By loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and only then can you love like this? And trust him, come what may. Very uncomfortable to Americans, but it's true. You know, verse 40, on these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Nothing like this was ever written in the whole of pagan literature. Nothing. Don't miss it. We've become lazily accustomed, familiar with this glorious teaching. This is Jesus and him alone. He's the one who gave us these principles. So let us be careful to remember that neglect of one or the other can bring us into real problems. Remember these. The first command induces the second. To love God induces love to others. The second is found only on the basis of the first. Why else would I deny myself and sacrifice myself for someone else if it's about evolution? Altruism doesn't make sense. It's contrary to Darwinism. Survival of the fittest says, take care of number one. Pursue yourself first. Health, wealth, prosperity of you. Don't worry about the others. The weak shall die. The only reason the second commandment to love your neighbor as yourself has the power it has is because it's rooted and grounded in the glorious God of the gospel. And it's given to us through the power of the cross and resurrection. Don't take the bait that's out there in the universities and all around television and everywhere else in social media that we can have love without God. It's a lie. It's like eating and enjoying and boasting about the fruit while you're swinging the axe at the root. Where do you think love comes from? It comes from God. It's like, I like to take C.S. Lewis's projection of the sun on the Bible and use it here for love and say, loving God is like the sun, but through the love of God, through that sunbeam, I see everything else. So loving God, through that, I can love others. There's a necessary dependency on the two. Let me just give you the biblical text for it and draw us to close. 1 John 4:19, we love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him. Whoever loves God must also love his brother. So it should caution us in both directions. I went in both directions. Don't take one without the other. For if we stress only that we love God and we're God lovers around here, and we have no genuine, practical, tangible, sacrificial, painful love for other people, then we are only hypocrites talking about love that we don't know. But also, secondly, if we go around advocating social concern at the expense of the centrality of God, then we don't truly know what love is. They must be together. And that is why the New Testament speaks of it being the fulfillment of the law itself. I wish I had time. I would take you all over the place. Romans 13 and Galatians 5 and James 2. And every place it talks about, for love is the fulfillment of the law. And I just want to remind us of this and bring us to that last part and close with application. And that is, think about the power of love. It has an expulsive power in it. I don't need a commandment to not commit adultery against my wife if I love her. When I married her, there wasn't a contract that said, now you can't do this, you can't commit adultery. The idea is, no, you gotta love me. If I'm motivated by love, there's no need for that. If I'm motivated by love for my fellow man, I don't need to obey the command not to murder. It just doesn't rise up in my appetite. I don't want to murder. Because I love. And the same is going to be true for God. If you love your God, you don't need to be commanded to not commit idolatry, to not be wrapped up in this world, in yourself and its fleeting pleasures. If you love God, it is the greatest of all. It's also against legalism then, isn't it? Jesus shows that above all, God requires that one's heart be right with him. Obedience to law without heart degenerates into legalism. Obedience to law without heart, without love, degenerates to legalism. So we don't need lawyers to tell us to strain the gnat. What we need is love, a heart that would love God. We don't need 613 commandments. We need 2. Laws never change hearts. We need love. We need love. We need a love that is so centered on Christ. But how many times do we hear these words proclaimed, and yet how seldom are they practiced? They're so uplifting, and yet they're so convicting, aren't they? Or is it just me? Happy would we be if only our lives were attuned more to this love. Here's my conclusion, and it's a powerful one, but I'll make it short. I think it's so critical that we take this little puzzle piece and say, okay, how does that fit in the big picture? Because this is not an encyclopedia entry to teach us on love. There was a man who was an expert in the law trying to trap Jesus. That was the response. So here's the deal. Not only is Jesus the Messiah, and nobody could disprove him, he silenced all his accusers. But here's the great irony. More than any other defying contest against him, this one of the 3, this one draws nearest the heart of the whole drama of his rejection. Why? What am I getting at? Jesus gives more than the best answer here. It's more than teaching us something. This is something so critical. It's about Jesus in coming into it, so when we leave the passage, we should also be thinking it's about Jesus. And here's the shocking irony. Had this man loved the Lord his God with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength, he would have recognized Jesus as the Christ and fallen on his face. Had this man known God, the Shema that he repeats every day twice, had he known, he would have seen, and he would have had a love for God in Christ and a love for man in Christ, for Jesus is both God and man, perhaps why he brought them together. If this is the greatest commandment, you want one? I'm going to give you 2. You see me as a man. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, but you're going to kill me. You hate me. That's how it fits in. That's why he turns the table, and while they're still gathered, verse 41, he's going to talk to them and say, who is the Son of Man? This man, I tell you, I have to stop, but it just gets me because he didn't need the right answer. He needed a new heart. Jesus said it this way in John 8:42, if God were your Father, you would love me, for I came from God and I am here. Expert in the law, if you knew God, you would love me. Now, this is impossible on our own. I've got to stop. I promise I will. I got to stop because I want to bring all of us to some place. Listen, at the end of the day, it's still a command, isn't it? To love. It gets under our skin because it's at the deepest place we fail. You see, we can all do things. We can do things easier and better than we can love. And that discrepancy is hypocrisy. And so here's the great challenge to everyone. No man has ever loved the Lord his God with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his mind, and with all his strength. No one except the one who spoke. Every man at the core hates God. I think Gerstner nails it. Man as sinner actually hates God. He hates man and hates himself. He would kill God if he could. He does kill his fellow man when he can, and he commits spiritual suicide every day of his life. You know what this results in? You know what this leaves us with? Not a law for you to go out and do. Instead, there's one word that just captivated me, and that's when Jesus said, on these 2 commandments, depend. The word means to hang, like a nail. Hang it. Hang it. Hang all the Torah, hang all the prophets, hang all the Old Testament Bible on those two things I just said. And my heart got heavy there. It didn't get lighter. Because that's the hardest commandment of them all. So right then and there, I'm condemned. And then I realize, no. It doesn't depend on me. It doesn't depend on my obedience, my loving. Ultimately, here's where we land. The reason Jesus is there being rejected is so that you can know the love of God. The reason he's being rejected by these leaders is so that you can know and be loved by God. He is love in the flesh. Every one of these reveals something about him. All the Old Testament, the prophets, and the Torah hang on Jesus, not on me. They hang on Jesus. So who's the greatest of them all? Christ. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the privilege. I pray that what you have impacted me with, I pray that you would impact others. Help us to be in awe. We could never obey and do your commands. We could never fulfill it from the heart, always comprehensively, committedly. Everything hangs on Christ. Oh, Lord, remind us of his words. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and scribes, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. But through Christ and his blood shed on our behalf, we can be forgiven, given new hearts, and see and enter the kingdom. I pray everyone in this room would bend the knee now, would confess their sins and cry out to Christ and ask for a new heart and seek for that love that we were made for. Thank you, Father. We pray this to the glory of Christ, and in his name, amen.